The silence in my garden is a language I've spent the last 5 years learning to speak. It's different from the other silences I've known. It's not the taut, humming silence of a command center before a mission goes live. It's not the heavy, breathless silence of a helicopter flying low over hostile terrain. It's a gentle, living quiet, punctuated by the buzz of a honeybee investigating a lavender bush, the rustle of a warm breeze through the leaves of my tomato plants, and the soft thud of ripe plums dropping onto the grass. This garden is my sanctuary. This small patch of earth behind my even smaller house is the only territory I've ever fought to conquer for myself. And my only weapons were a trowel and a stubborn refusal to give up on the hard, clay-rich soil. Every flower, every vegetable is a small, quiet victory. If you've ever had to build a whole new life for yourself, not the one anyone expected of you, but the one your soul demanded, then you know what this peace feels like. It's an earned peace. Hit that like button if you know the feeling. It's a quiet kind of power, and for a long time, it was enough. I was trimming back a rose bush, my hands protected by thick leather gloves, when my phone began to buzz from its spot on the patio table. I didn't have to look at it to know who was calling. In my family, I am a problem to be managed. And my younger sister, Clara, is the designated manager. I sighed, snipped one last errant branch, and pulled off my gloves. Wiping the sweat from my brow, I walked over and picked up the phone. The screen glowed with a picture of Clara and her fiancé, their smiles wide and blindingly white, taken on a sailboat somewhere picturesque, of course. "Clara," I answered, my voice calm. "Ellie, I was hoping I'd catch you," she chirped. Her voice has always been an octave higher than necessary, a perpetually cheerful instrument that she uses to get exactly what she wants. "You weren't, like, in the middle of anything important, were you?" The unspoken half of that question was, "It's not like you ever have anything important to do anyway. Just pottering around in the garden. Clara, what's up?" "Oh, good. Well, I'm calling about Friday. You are coming to dinner, right at Mom and Dad's to celebrate me and Alex, her fiancé, Commander Alex Preston, a rising star in the Army, a West Point graduate, Ranger tabbed, with a command position that had my father, a man who'd never served a day in his life, practically saluting every time Alex walked into a room. Alex was everything my family valued: ambitious, visible, successful in a way they could understand and brag about at the country club. He was, in short, everything I was not. I got the calendar invite. "Yes, I'll be there," I said. "Oh, wonderful," she gushed. "It's just so important to Mom and Dad, and Alex is really looking forward to, spending more time with my family." Another translation was required. What she meant was, Alex is a good sport who is willing to tolerate my weird, reclusive older sister for a few hours, and we need you to perform your role as the quiet spinster aunt so the family picture looks complete. I'm 48 years old, in my family's eyes. This makes me a tragic figure, in a world where a woman's worth is measured by her husband, her children, and her career. I had apparently failed on all three counts. I was unmarried, I was childless, and my career. Well, that was the biggest failure of all. For 25 years, I had a government job in Washington, D.C. That's all they knew. It was vague. It was secretive by nature. And it apparently came with a pension that allowed me to retire early to this small, mortgaged house in a quiet corner of Virginia. They imagined I was some kind of mid-level bureaucrat, a paper pusher in a vast gray cubicle farm, shuffling memos until my soul atrophied. They imagined my retirement wasn't a choice, but a quiet dismissal, put out to pasture after a thoroughly unremarkable career. The truth was something I'd locked away in a vault so deep, I sometimes forgot where the key was. It was easier that way. My reality was too large, too sharp-edged, to fit into their small, neat world. So I had allowed their narrative to become the official story. Eleanor Vance, the one who had all that potential and never quite lived up to it. The one who was smart, but not ambitious. The one who just faded. I had become an invisible woman. "I'm sure it will be a lovely evening," I said, the words tasting like polite dust. "It will be an Ellie. Try to be a little sociable. Okay, Alex's parents might be there. Just make an effort. For me, the condescension was so ingrained. She didn't even hear it in her own voice. The plea for me to make an effort was a classic. It was the same thing she'd said before Christmas, before my father's birthday, before every family gathering for the last 20 years. The implication was always clear: my natural state was somehow unacceptable, and I needed to put on a performance to be deemed worthy of their company. "I will be my usual, charming self. Clara," I said, my voice dry. She missed the irony completely. "Great. Okay, I have to run. We're looking at wedding venues. It is so stressful, you have no idea. See you Friday." She hung up, leaving me in the silence of my garden once more. But the silence was different now. It was tainted. The upcoming dinner was a storm front moving in, promising high winds and a deluge of judgment. I sank into one of the patio chairs. The problem was, I remembered everything. I remembered the Christmas, 5 years ago, right after I'd retired. My father, after a few too many glasses of port, had put his arm around me and said, in front of everyone, "Well, Ellie's home for good now. Never did get that corner office. But she's got a good heart. That's what counts." Right, he'd said it with a sad, loving smile. A verbal pat on the head for his failed child. At the time, I'd just come from a debriefing at the Pentagon about a drone program that had saved hundreds of lives but cost us 2 assets on the ground. The cognitive dissonance was so staggering, I almost laughed. I remembered Clara's wedding shower for her first marriage, the one that had ended in a messy divorce 2 years later, where her friends had cornered me, asking what it was like to be a career woman in D.C., when my answers about policy analysis and interagency logistics were suitably boring. They drifted away, their eyes glazed over. How could I have explained to them that interagency logistics sometimes meant coordinating with the CIA and NSA to move a high-value asset out of a hostile country? I couldn't. So I let them think I was boring. It was my camouflage. This quiet life I'd built wasn't a consolation prize. It was a conscious, deliberate choice. It was the long, slow process of decompressing after a life lived at the highest possible pressure. My small house was not a sign of a small pension. It was a sign that I no longer had a need for pretense. My solitude was not loneliness. It was recovery. My hands, which my mother lamented were not soft and manicured, were strong. They could break down and reassemble a rifle in under a minute, but they could also coax a stubborn orchid into bloom, my mind, which my family thought was filled with little more than grocery lists and daytime television. Still ran threat assessments on every room I entered and could recall satellite imagery from a decade ago. I was General Eleanor Vance. I had been one of the very few women in the history of the United States Army to earn a 4th star. I had commanded more troops than the entire population of my hometown. I had advised presidents. I had borne a weight of responsibility that would have crushed my father, a man who stressed about his golf handicap. And to them, I was a nobody. The irony wasn't just an occasional visitor anymore. It was a permanent resident in my soul. I stood up and went inside, the thought of the dinner on Friday settling in my stomach like a cold stone. Why did I agree to go? It was a question I asked myself every time. The answer was complicated. It was a tangled mess of residual love, of a deeply ingrained sense of duty to the role of daughter and sister, and maybe, if I was being honest with myself, a morbid curiosity. I was like an anthropologist studying a strange, baffling tribe that I just happened to be related to by blood. I walked through my small house. It was immaculate, organized, not in a fussy way, but in a way that spoke of discipline. Every book on my shelf was arranged by subject. The kitchen counters were clear. There was no clutter, no extraneous objects. For 25 years, my life had been about stripping away the non-essential, about focusing only on the mission. It was a hard habit to break. On the mantelpiece, there was only one framed photograph. It wasn't of my family. It was a picture of me and my command team, taken in Afghanistan. We were all dusty, exhausted, and smiling. We were standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter. To any casual observer, it was just a picture of soldiers. But I knew the story behind it. I knew that 12 hours before that photo was taken, we had been in a situation so dire that I didn't think any of us would be coming home. The man standing to my right, my command sergeant major, had taken a bullet meant for me. The woman on my left, my chief of intelligence, had averted a catastrophic failure with a brilliant, last-minute call. That photograph wasn't a memory of a war. It was a testament to a different kind of family, a family forged in fire and loyalty. My real family, the one I was born into, would never understand that. How could they? Their idea of a crisis was the caterer being late. The dinner on Friday would be held at my parents' house, a large, colonial-style home with a perfectly manicured lawn that looked like it was maintained by a team of surgeons. It was a house built to project success. It was a stage. And on Friday, Clara and Alex would be the stars of the show. I would be a stagehand, a shadowy figure in the wings, there to make sure the spotlight on them was as bright as possible. I already knew how the evening would play out. My mother would kiss my cheek and tell me I looked tired. My father would shake my hand, call me kiddo, and immediately ask me if I'd seen the new car Alex was driving. Clara would treat me with a kind of bright, brittle solicitude. As if I were a fragile antique she was afraid of breaking. They would ask me no real questions about my life, because they had already decided what my life was. It was small and gray and sad, and any evidence to the contrary was an inconvenience to their narrative. I walked into my study and sat down at my simple wooden desk. I looked at the summons on my calendar. Dinner for Clara and Alex with a string of champagne bottle emojis. A summons to my own judgment day. And I had accepted the charge. I would go. I would put on my costume of pleasant obscurity. I would endure the passive aggressions and the pitying looks. I would play my part in their family drama one more time, because a good general always surveys the battlefield before making a final, strategic decision, and I had a feeling that this dinner, this ridiculous, celebratory tribunal, was going to be the final piece of intelligence I needed. On Friday, I arrived at my parents' house at precisely 6:00 p.m. in my former life. Punctuality wasn't a courtesy, it was a matter of life and death. For my family, it was just another quirk they found vaguely amusing. I wore what I always wore to these things, a pair of black tailored trousers, a simple silk blouse in a charcoal gray, and flat leather shoes. It was an outfit designed to be a void, to attract no attention, to offer no opinions. It was my civilian stealth wear. My mother opened the door before I could even ring the bell, as if she'd been lying in wait. She was wearing a brightly colored dress, her hair perfectly coiffed. She looked me up and down, and her smile, which was already stretched a little too thin, tightened at the edges. "Eleanor, you're here," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "Oh, honey, that's what you're wearing. It's a celebration. It's clean and it fits." "Patricia," I said, using her first name, a small act of rebellion she always chose to ignore. "The house looks lovely." "Thank you. Your father is in the study with Alex. They're talking about, well, important things. Clara is on the patio. Go on." She bustled away toward the kitchen, already dismissing me. I walked through the immaculate, museum-like living room. Every surface gleamed. Every pillow was chopped. It was a house that was perpetually ready for a magazine shoot. And just as sterile. Have you ever been in a room full of people who are supposed to love you, but you've never felt more alone? It's a bizarre feeling, to be an outsider on the inside. That was my permanent address in this house. I found my father and Alex in the study, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of my father's expensive scotch. My father, Richard, was leaning against his massive desk, looking intently at Alex, who was sitting in one of the leather armchairs. And the key to leadership, I've always said, my father was pontificating, is decisiveness. You can't be afraid to make the tough calls. My father's entire professional life had been spent as a mid-level executive at a regional bank, where his toughest call was likely deciding which flavor of donuts to bring to the Friday morning meeting. The fact that he was lecturing a decorated army commander on leadership would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. He saw me hovering in the doorway. "Ellie, there she is. Come on in. Kiddo? Alex. You know my Eleanor." Alex stood up politely. He was tall and fit, with the kind of clean cut, confident good looks that made parents trust him instantly. "Eleanor, good to see you again." "You too, Alex." "Congratulations on the engagement," I said, shaking his offered hand. His grip was firm. "Thanks, we're really excited." He was trying to be nice, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't know what to do with me. I was a loose variable in the otherwise perfect equation of his new family. He was a commander. I was his fiancée's weird, quiet older sister. We had no common ground. Oh, the irony. So, Eleanor, my father said, sloshing the amber liquid in his glass. Keeping busy, re-alphabetizing your spice rack, talking to your plants. He meant it as a joke, a harmless ribbing, but underneath it was the sharp, pointed stick of his perception of me. My life, to him, was a series of small, meaningless, solitary hobbies. Something like that, I said, letting the comment slide off me. I'd spent decades perfecting a kind of emotional armor. Very little got through unless I allowed it to. Clara swept in then, a whirlwind of bright fabric and expensive perfume. There you are, Daddy. Stop monopolizing my fiancé. She kissed Alex, then turned to me. Ellie, you look fine. Mom needs help with the appetizers. And just like that, I was dismissed. The men were left to continue their important conversation, and I was relegated to the kitchen, the traditional domain of the family's unmarried, and therefore unoccupied. Women? The dinner itself was an exercise in masterful passive aggression. I was seated between my mother and an empty chair that was apparently for Alex's parents, who had canceled at the last minute, much to my mother's distress. The entire conversation orbited around Alex and Clara like planets around a sun. We heard about the wedding plans, a massive affair at the most exclusive venue in the state. We heard about Alex's recent training exercise, a story he told with practiced humility, but which was clearly designed to impress. My father hung on his every word. That's incredible, Richard said, shaking his head in admiration. The logistics alone. It takes a real leader to pull something like that off. A man of action. That's what this country needs more of. He said it while looking at Alex, but the implicit comparison was aimed directly at me, the silent, inactive woman at his table, the one who, in his mind, had never done anything of consequence. My last command had involved coordinating the actions of over 150,000 personnel across 3 continents. But I just took a slow sip of my water and said nothing. My mother tried to draw me in her own clumsy way. Eleanor, you worked for the government. You must have been in some interesting meetings, right? Mostly just budget reviews. Mom, I said, offering up my standard, boring line. You'd be surprised how much time is spent arguing over the cost of paper clips. My father snorted, figures, bureaucracy. A bunch of people sitting around, pushing paper. While the real work gets done by men like Alex, the meal continued like this. Every topic was a chance to highlight my perceived inadequacies. When they talked about finances and investments, my small pension was the unspoken joke. When they talked about their friends' children getting married and having babies, my single, childless status was the elephant in the room. I just ate my pot roast, which was, I had to admit, delicious. I focused on the food, on the physical sensations, a technique I'd learned long ago to distance myself from psychological pressure. The texture of the carrots, the warmth of the gravy, the weight of the silverware in my hand. I became a sensory machine, an observer in my own body. And then came the toast. My father stood up, holding his wine glass. He tapped it with a fork, and the table fell silent. He beamed, his face flushed with wine and pride. I want to propose a toast, he began, his voice taking on a formal, momentous tone, to my daughter, Clara, who has always made us so proud, and to the man she's bringing into our family, Commander Alex Preston. He smiled at them. They smiled back, a perfect portrait of happiness. You know, he continued, looking around the table, as a parent, you have hopes for your children. You want them to have full lives. You want them to find purpose, to make a mark on the world, to build something that lasts. You want them to have the courage to go out there and be somebody. He paused, letting that phrase hang in the air. His eyes flickered toward me for a single, infinitesimal moment. It was so fast. Anyone else would have missed it. But I wasn't anyone else. I was trained to notice the slightest tells, the most subtle shifts in demeanor. It was a glance loaded with a lifetime of disappointment. Alex, you're a born leader, a man who understands duty, honor, and achievement. You are a somebody in the truest sense of the word. And Clara, you've built a wonderful life for yourself. You've made smart choices. You've succeeded. We are so, so proud of you both." He raised his glass higher. He was coming to the grand finale. This was the moment he would deliver the killing blow. The one he'd probably been formulating in his head all evening. "It just goes to show you," he said, his voice swelling with paternal wisdom. "Life is about the choices you make. You can choose to strive, to build, to create a legacy, or you can choose to sit on the sidelines." And while some people reach for the stars, he looked directly at Alex and Clara. Some, I suppose, are just content to be a nobody. There it was. The word nobody. It wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, dismissive, final judgment, delivered with a sad smile over a fancy dinner table. He had taken all his disappointment in me, all his frustration with my incomprehensible life choices, and he had distilled it into a single, poisonous word. He had publicly declared me null and void, a zero, a nobody. The air in the room changed. I felt it. The temperature seemed to drop. I saw a flicker of genuine shock in Alex's eyes. He looked uncomfortable, like he knew a line had been crossed. Clara's perfect smile faltered, and she shot a quick, nervous glance at me. Even my mother looked down at her plate, a silent accomplice to the execution. And me? I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't look away. I held my father's gaze. The emotional armor I had worn for decades held firm, but underneath it, a cold, tectonic shift was happening. A fault line that had been under pressure for my entire life had just ruptured. The rage I felt was so pure, so cold. It was almost serene. It was the kind of clarity that only comes after a massive detonation. In that moment, looking at the man who was supposed to be my greatest champion, I finally understood. The war was over. I had spent years trying to win a battle he had declared on my behalf, a battle against my own nature, and I had lost. But maybe losing, I thought, was just another word for being set free. He finished his toast, to Clara and Alex. To Clara and Alex, my mother echoed weakly. I raised my own glass. I looked my father dead in the eye, a faint, unreadable smile on my lips, and I drank. The wine tasted like ashes, but I drank it anyway, because this was the end. This was the Last Supper. They just didn't know it yet. I drove home from my parents' house with the windows closed and the radio off. The 10-mile drive felt like a journey across a barren planet. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the furious, silent screaming inside my own head when I had left. They had all been standing in the entryway, their faces etched with a strange mixture of confusion and unease. My calm, smiling acceptance of my father's toast had rattled them more than any outburst could have. They didn't know what to do with a version of me that didn't crumble. "Thank you for dinner, Mom, Dad," I had said, my voice perfectly level. It was very illuminating. My mother had just stared at me, speechless. My father had a dark, mottled flush high on his cheekbones. Only Clara had spoken, Ellie. "Wait," she'd started, a look of genuine conflict in her eyes, but I just gave her a small, sad smile, turned, and walked out the door. I didn't look back, now, in the sanctuary of my own small house. The mask of unbreakable calm finally dissolved, but I didn't cry. The wound was too deep, too clean for tears. It was a surgical incision, straight to the heart, instead. A lifetime of suppressed fury coalesced into a single point of cold. Crystalline clarity. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where all the static, all the noise, all the confusion of your life just stops, and in the profound silence that's left behind, you see the path forward with a certainty that is terrifying and exhilarating all at once. You know, with every fiber of your being, what you have to do next. That's where I was. The word nobody hadn't just been an insult, it had been a key. It had unlocked the final door, and shown me the truth I had been avoiding for years. My relationship with my family was not salvageable. It wasn't something to be fixed. It was a terminal illness, and I had just been given the diagnosis. The only question left was how I wanted to spend my remaining time. I walked into my study, the room where I kept the few carefully chosen artifacts from my other life. My eyes fell on the challenge coins lined up on my bookshelf, heavy brass and silver discs from units I had commanded, from foreign dignitaries, from missions that would never be declassified. Each one represented a chapter in a story my family would never read. My father thought my life was about spice racks and gardening. He had no concept of the life I had actually led. He didn't know about the nights I'd spent in the White House Situation Room, the fate of nations hanging on the intelligence I was presenting. He didn't know I had personally negotiated the release of hostages from a warlord in a country whose name he could probably barely pronounce. He didn't know that the reason I have a slight, almost imperceptible limp on rainy days is because the armored vehicle I was in hit an anti-tank mine outside of Kandahar, an incident that was covered up as a training accident. He didn't know because I never told him, in the beginning. It was for security reasons. My career path, moving from tactical command into strategic intelligence and special operations oversight, was shrouded in classification. But later, the secrecy became a shield. Not for the nation, but for me. It was a way to protect what was most sacred to me from their judgment, their misunderstanding, their inevitable attempts to turn my life's work into a boring anecdote for their friends. My early retirement wasn't a failure. It was the culmination of a promise I had made to myself. After my final tour as the commanding general of all U.S. forces in a particularly brutal theater of war, I had been offered a prestigious post at the Pentagon, a job that would have meant a lifetime of political battles under fluorescent lights. I turned it down. I had served my country for 25 years. I had given it my youth, my health, and the possibility of a family of my own. I had reached the highest peak. I had nothing left to prove. All I wanted was the silence of a garden. It was the most defiant, most selfish, and most necessary decision of my life. I picked up the framed photograph from my mantle, the one of my command team in Afghanistan. I traced the face of my command sergeant major, David Chen, a good man, a man who had seen me at my best and my worst, a man who knew the weight of the 4 stars that had rested on my shoulders. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. It was a text from him. "Ma'am, you good? Haven't heard from you in a bit." David was one of the few people who had my personal number and my implicit permission to use it. He had retired a year after I did and now ran a nonprofit that helped veterans transition to civilian life. He knew about my family. He'd never met them. But he'd listened to me talk about them on long, quiet nights at Bagram Airfield, the only times I ever let the armor crack. Instead of texting back, I called him. He answered immediately. "General," his voice was a familiar, grounding rumble. "Don't call me that, David. I'm just Eleanor now, remember." "Sorry, ma'am. Habit. You okay? You sound different." "I had dinner with my family tonight," I said. A long, knowing silence on his end. "Ah," he said finally, "say no more. Did your dad ask you if you were getting enough fiber in your diet again?" I let out a short, sharp laugh. Worse, he called me a nobody. The line went completely quiet. The friendly banter in David's voice vanished, replaced by the deadly calm of the soldier he used to be. "He what?" "It's a long story, the usual. My sister's fiancé is a commander, a man of action. I, apparently, am not." "With all due respect, ma'am," David said, his voice tight with a cold fury I knew all too well. "Your father is an ignorant son of a bitch, a nobody. You commanded the entire goddamn theater. Men with more power and influence than he could ever dream of pissed their pants when you walked into a room. You've been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, for Christ's sake, a nobody." "It doesn't matter, David," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. He just confirmed what I already knew. "It's over. I'm done trying." "Good," he said simply. "It was painful to watch you try, ma'am, seeing you fold yourself up to fit into their little box. It was never going to work." We talked for a while longer, about his nonprofit, about some of the guys from our old unit. "It was easy, it was real, before we hung up," he said. "By the way, Alex Preston's unit is hosting their annual regimental gala in a few weeks. A lot of the old guard from Fort Belvoir will be there. You should go. Remind them what a real general looks like." He meant it as a joke, but the words sparked something in me. The gala. Clara had mentioned it. A big formal affair. Alex's commanding officer would be there. The entire leadership of his world. A world my family was so desperate to be a part of. After I hung up, I couldn't shake the idea for hours. I just sat in my study, replaying the dinner, my father's words, my conversation with David. The idea of going to the gala was absurd. It was walking right back into the fire. It was everything I was trying to escape. But then, a new thought began to form. A strategic thought. My entire life had been about strategy, about seeing the whole board, about anticipating the moves of my opponent and planning 10 steps ahead. My family thought the war was over, that they had won a decisive victory at the dinner table. They had no idea they had just handed me the very weapon I needed to end the campaign. Once and for all, what if I went to the gala? Not for revenge. Revenge was a messy, emotional motive, and I didn't operate that way. Not to show them up. Their opinion no longer mattered, but to close the file, to declassify the truth, not for them, but for me. To attend one last event as the person they thought I was, and let their world collide with the world I actually inhabited. It would be a controlled demolition, a final, clean break. The official invitation arrived in the mail 2 days later. A thick, cream-colored card addressed to me at my parents' house, and forwarded by my mother with a passive-aggressive little note. I assume you won't want to go to this, but I thought you should see it. I held the invitation in my hand. The commander of the 75th Ranger Regiment requests the pleasure of your company at the annual regimental gala. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about the dusty rose dress from the last story I had imagined myself in. No, not this time. This time would be different. I wouldn't be going as the meek, disappointing daughter. I wouldn't be going as a nobody. I would be going as me. General Eleanor Vance, U.S. Army, retired. They just wouldn't know it until it was too late. I walked over to my closet and opened the doors. Past the sensible trousers and gray blouses, deep in the back, was a garment bag that hadn't been opened in 5 years. I unzipped it. Inside, perfectly preserved, was my formal mess dress uniform, the dark blue jacket, the gold trim, the rows of brightly colored ribbons on the chest, a lifetime of service translated into silk and enamel. And on the shoulder boards, sewn with heavy gold thread, were 4 silver stars. I wasn't going to wear the uniform. That would be too obvious, a declaration of war. My strategy was more subtle than that. But just seeing it reminded me of the promise I had made to myself when I took it off for the last time. A promise to live a life of peace and integrity. And I realized the only way to keep that promise now was to face this one last battle. I picked up the phone and dialed the RSVP number on the invitation. Yes, hello, I said, my voice calm and clear. This is Eleanor Vance. I would be delighted to attend the night of the gala. I got ready with the same meticulous calm I once used to prepare for a parachute jump into hostile territory. Every action was deliberate, purposeful. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. The woman who had agonized over a dusty rose dress felt like a character from someone else's story. Now, you might think I was nervous, or that I was plotting some kind of grand, dramatic revenge, but you'd be wrong. I felt nothing of the sort. My emotional state was one of serene, absolute calm. I wasn't going to the gala as a participant in my family's drama anymore. I was going as an observer, a theater-goer with a front-row seat to the final act of a play I had decided to quit. I chose my armor carefully. It was a dress I'd had for years, bought for a diplomatic function in Brussels and worn exactly once. It was a floor-length sheath of heavy, midnight blue silk. It had no lace, no sequins, no frills. It was severe in its simplicity, with long sleeves and a high, elegant neckline. It was the kind of dress that did not ask for attention, but commanded respect through its sheer, understated quality. It was a dress that said its wearer was not to be trifled with. I paired it with simple pearl earrings and low, black pumps. My hair, which was mostly silver now, was swept back into a clean, tight chignon. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a nobody. I saw a woman who knew exactly who she was. The general was not in uniform, but she was present. I arrived at the armory where the gala was being held and handed my keys to the valet. As I stepped out of my sensible, 10-year-old sedan, parked between a brand new Porsche and a massive luxury SUV, I felt a flicker of amusement. It was the perfect metaphor for how my family saw me. But the moment I walked through the massive double doors, everything changed. The air inside hummed with a frequency I knew in my bones. It was a world of crisp uniforms, of metals clinking softly, of the scent of floor wax and starched linen. A string quartet was playing in the corner, but underneath it was the rumbling bass line of hundreds of conversations, all conducted with a certain level of military formality. The regimental colors, the flags representing the unit's history and honor, were displayed proudly on the stage. And you know that feeling when you walk into a room and it just feels right, like your molecules are finally vibrating at the correct frequency. That's what this felt like. I wasn't an awkward outsider here. I was a ghost, back in my old haunting grounds. I moved through the crowded reception hall with an ease that I never felt in my parents' living room. I knew how to navigate this terrain. I knew the subtle language of a nod between officers, the invisible lines of rank and respect that governed every interaction. I secured a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and found a strategic position, a quiet spot near a large pillar with a clear line of sight to the main floor. My own personal observation post. From here, I could see it all. And there they were, my family. They were holding court near the entrance, a tight little island of civilian anxiety in a sea of military confidence. My father was in a tuxedo that was a little too tight, laughing a little too loudly. My mother was fluttering around, adjusting my father's tie, her eyes wide as she took in the powerful people surrounding them. And Clara, my sister, was radiant in a glittering champagne-colored gown. She was clinging to the arm of her fiancé, Commander Alex Preston. They looked like the perfect couple, a snapshot of success. They hadn't seen me yet. I watched them for a while, with the detached curiosity of a field biologist observing a family of particularly baffling primates. I watched my father try to engage a 2-star general, who gave him a polite but brief nod before moving on. I watched my mother compliment the general's wife on her necklace with a desperate, cloying sweetness. I watched them try so hard to belong to a world they fundamentally misunderstood. They thought it was about power and prestige. They didn't understand it was about service and sacrifice. Finally, Clara's eyes scanned the room and landed on me. Her smile faltered. A look of pure, unadulterated shock crossed her face, followed quickly by annoyance. She leaned over and whispered something to my mother. My mother's head whipped around, and her expression was a carbon copy of Clara's. They began a hushed, frantic conversation. My father and Alex were drawn in. The 4 of them stood there for a moment, staring at me from across the room as if I were an apparition. Slowly, they began to make their way toward me, a united front of disapproval. This was going to be even more interesting than I thought. Eleanor, my mother said, her voice a sharp, accusatory whisper. What on earth are you doing here? I forwarded you that invitation as a courtesy. I never imagined you would actually come. You look nice, Mom, I said calmly, taking a sip of my water. Don't you look nice, Mom me, my father growled, his face already turning red. After the scene you made at dinner, you have a lot of nerve showing your face here. This is a big night for Alex, for Clara. I arched an eyebrow. The scene I made Richard. I believe I sat in perfect silence. You were the one giving the speeches. My father's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to me talking back. He wasn't used to this calm, unbothered version of me. Clara stepped forward, placing a placating hand on my father's arm. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. Ellie, please, she said, her voice low. Why are you here to make a point to embarrass us? Why would my presence be embarrassing, Clara? I asked, my voice genuinely curious. Am I not dressed appropriately? Am I not behaving myself? You know what I mean, she snapped, her frustration boiling over. After dinner, after Dad's toast, we just thought you'd have the decency to stay away. Decency. That was a fascinating choice of words. It was indecent of me to show up and remind them of their own cruelty. I'm not here for you, I said simply. And the truth of it felt liberating. I'm not here for any of you. I'm just enjoying the party. Alex, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Eleanor, he said, his tone trying for diplomacy. I think what they're trying to say is that this is an important networking opportunity for me. My commanding officer is here. It's a delicate situation. I see, I said, looking him directly in the eye. And my presence here somehow threatens your networking opportunities. No, of course not, he said quickly. It's just unexpected. Well, I said with a faint smile, I'm full of surprises. I turned my attention back to the room, effectively ending the conversation. They stood there for another awkward moment, unsure what to do. They had expected me to be ashamed, or angry, or apologetic. They had no protocol for this serene, untouchable stranger who looked like their daughter. Defeated, they muttered their excuses and retreated back to the center of the room, leaving me to my observation post. The rest of the evening unfolded as I knew it would. I watched them work the room. I watched my sister laugh dazzlingly at the jokes of colonels. I watched my father corner a hapless major to talk about the stock market. They were performing. They were desperate for a taste of the power they perceived in this room. My focus, however, was on one man in particular, Colonel James Miller, Alex's commanding officer. He was a tall, silver-haired man with a quiet, authoritative presence. I knew who he was. I had read his file years ago when he was up for a promotion. He was a good officer, a smart, capable leader with a distinguished combat record. I watched as Alex and Clara finally got their audience with him. Alex was standing stiffly, trying to look both relaxed and respectful. Clara was at his side, the perfect, charming fiancée. They were talking, smiling. Colonel Miller was nodding politely, his eyes scanning the room as he listened. I took another sip of my water. I felt no anger, no bitterness, just a profound, almost zen-like sense of inevitability. The gears of the universe were turning, and a long overdue course correction was about to be made. I wasn't the one doing it. All I had done was show up. All I had done was refuse to be a nobody any longer. I watched Colonel Miller's gaze sweep across the ballroom. It passed over a group of lieutenants, over the wife of a congressman, over my own parents, who were watching the scene with rapt attention. His eyes were professional, slightly distant, and then his gaze continued its sweep. It hit me, and it stopped. Colonel James Miller, a man in command of one of the most elite units in the U.S. Army, froze mid-nod. His polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter, profound disbelief. His back, which was already straight, somehow became straighter. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to clear a faulty image from his optic nerve. Alex and Clara were still talking, completely oblivious. They didn't notice the colonel's attention was no longer on them. They didn't see his face pale slightly. They didn't see the dawning, thunderstruck recognition in his eyes. But I saw it. From across the crowded, noisy ballroom, I saw the exact moment that a colonel in the United States Army recognized his former commanding general. The storm had arrived, and the calm was about to break. The entire ballroom, with its hundreds of guests and swirling conversations, seemed to narrow to the single, invisible line that now connected me to Colonel James Miller. For a moment, he remained frozen, his polite cocktail party expression completely wiped away, replaced by a look of such profound, unadulterated shock that if he'd been holding a glass, he would have dropped it. Alex and Clara, still basking in the glow of their own importance, hadn't noticed. They continued their bright, cheerful patter, talking to a man who was no longer listening, no longer even truly seeing them. His focus had collapsed entirely onto me. From across the room, I watched the gears turn in his head, the disbelief warring with recognition, the confusion giving way to a dawning, stunning certainty. He was a seasoned officer, a man trained to assess situations in a heartbeat, and he was currently processing a piece of intelligence so unexpected, so out of context, that it had momentarily scrambled his entire system. Then, with a decisiveness that was second nature to a man of his rank, he acted. He turned his back on my sister and her fiancé mid-sentence. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't say, "Pardon me for a moment." He simply disengaged, as if they had ceased to exist, and he started walking. He walked toward me. His path cut a straight, unwavering line across the polished dance floor, people officers and their spouses, Civilians and their guests seemed to sense the sudden shift in gravity around him, parting before him like the Red Sea. His stride was not casual. It was purposeful. It was the walk of a man on a mission. My family, standing in a tight, unhappy cluster not far from me, watched his approach with bewildered expressions. They probably assumed he was heading for the bar or to speak with another, more important guest. The idea that his destination was me, their invisible daughter, was so far outside their realm of possibility that it didn't even register. I didn't move. I simply stood by my pillar, my glass of water held loosely in my hand, and I waited. My heart was not racing. My palms were not sweating. I felt a profound and absolute calm, the kind a commander feels when they see a long-planned strategy unfolding exactly as anticipated. I had rolled the dice, and now I was simply watching to see where they would land. As Colonel Miller got closer, I could see the details of his expression. The shock was still there, but it was now overlaid with a deep, unmistakable deference, awe. He stopped about 5 feet in front of me, a respectful distance. His posture, which was already military straight, somehow became even more rigid. It was a subtle, almost unconscious bracing, the way an officer stands when addressing a superior of significant rank. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low and incredulous. He cleared his throat, as if unsure his voice would work properly. My family had fallen silent now, watching this bizarre interaction. What could this important, decorated colonel possibly want with their Eleanor? The colonel took another look, his eyes taking in my simple blue dress, my quiet demeanor, and reconciling it with the memory he held in his mind. The memory of a different woman, in a different place, wearing a different uniform. And then he said the words that were the entire purpose of the evening, the words that would serve as the final, official end to the story my family had written for me. "I can't believe it," he said, shaking his head slightly. His voice was clear now, carrying in the small pocket of silence that had formed around us. He looked me in the eye, and the full weight of his respect, his memory, his understanding of a world my family couldn't even imagine, was in his gaze. "Welcome back, General." General. The word did not just land in the room, it detonated. It was a sonic boom that shattered the placid atmosphere, a single word that contained a universe of meaning they could not comprehend. For a split second, there was only stunned silence. The word seemed to hang in the air, shimmering, impossible. Then came the fallout. My father's face, which had been a mask of smug annoyance, went completely blank. His mouth fell slightly open. He looked from the colonel to me and back again, his brain utterly refusing to process the input. It was a system error of catastrophic proportions. My mother let out a small, audible gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Her eyes were wide with a horror that was slowly being eclipsed by utter confusion. Clara just stared, her face a comical mask of disbelief. "General," she mouthed silently, her voice gone. "And Alex, Commander Alex Preston, as a professional soldier, he understood the word. He understood the galaxies of distance that separated a commander from a 4-star general. He understood that the woman his future father-in-law had called a nobody was, in military terms, a living deity." The color drained from his face. He looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Colonel Miller, oblivious to the family implosion he had just triggered, continued, his voice full of sincere respect. "Ma'am, we weren't sure when you'd be stateside again. The last I heard, you'd taken that advisory post with the NATO Joint Command after you retired the colors. It is an honor to see you." He had just added a second, even more devastating payload. He had not only confirmed my rank, he had confirmed my status on the global stage. He had confirmed that my quiet retirement was anything but. That's when my family's paralysis broke, and chaos erupted. "General," my father sputtered. Finding his voice, it was loud, incredulous, and rude. He took a step toward the colonel. "What did you just call her? What is the meaning of this? Who are you?" Colonel Miller turned his head slightly to look at my father, his expression shifting from deference toward me to one of cold, professional appraisal. He was looking at a loud, unknown civilian who was behaving erratically. Before he could answer, I intervened. This was my operation to command. I gave the colonel a small, calm smile. "Colonel Miller, it's good to see you. James, you're looking well." Using his first name was a deliberate choice. It established a familiar rapport that completely excluded my family. The colonel's face relaxed slightly. You too, General. Retirement agrees with you. It has its moments, I said. We must catch up later. I'm sure you have duties to attend to. It was a polite, but clear, dismissal, an order wrapped in courtesy. Of course, General, he said instantly, giving me a sharp, respectful nod. He cast one last, bewildered look at my sputtering father and then turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the smoking crater he had created. Now they turned on me. Eleanor, what was that? My mother demanded, her voice shrill. Why did that man call you that? What is going on? A general, you, my father scoffed, a desperate, angry disbelief warring in his eyes. That's impossible. You pushed papers in some basement office in the Pentagon. You told us. No, I said, my voice quiet, but it cut through their frantic noise like a surgeon's scalpel. I never told you that. You decided that. You wrote a story for me. A story about a quiet, unremarkable failure. Because it was easier than dealing with a daughter you didn't understand. I looked at my father. At dinner, 2 weeks ago, you called me a nobody. You stood at the head of your table and you dismissed my entire existence. You passed judgment on a life you knew nothing about. I was making a point, he stammered, his bluster failing him. Yes, you were, I said. And so am I. Right now, you wanted to know why I never shared my life with you. This is why, because my life's work, the sacrifices I made, the people I led, the very real dangers I faced, they are not things to be measured against your petty, civilian standards of success. They are not anecdotes to be trotted out to impress your friends at the country club. They are mine, and your judgment made you unworthy of sharing in them. We're your family, my mother cried, tears welling in her eyes. A family doesn't call one of its own a nobody, I replied, my voice still devoid of heat, but full of a final, unbreakable conviction. A family doesn't belittle and dismiss. A family doesn't require its members to shrink themselves down to be acceptable. I turned my gaze to Clara, whose face was pale and tear-streaked, and to Alex, who was looking at me with an expression of such profound, shell-shocked respect that it was almost comical. This is over now, I said, speaking to all of them. The performance is done. The lies you told yourselves about me, they stopped tonight. You wanted to be part of a world of power and prestige so badly. Well, tonight you got a glimpse of it. I hope you enjoyed the show. I put my half-empty glass of water down on a nearby table. The sound was a quiet, final click in the stunned silence. Do not call me tomorrow, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. Do not try to fix this. There is nothing to fix. There is only a truth you must now learn to live with. Without another word, I turned my back on their shattered faces. I walked away from them, through the center of the ballroom. My head held high. I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel the eyes of everyone on me, but for the first time, I didn't care. I was no longer an invisible woman. I was a general, and I was walking off the battlefield, victorious, on my own terms. I walked out of the gala and into the cool, dark embrace of the Virginia night, the valet, a young man with wide eyes who had clearly overheard the commotion, practically sprinted to get my car, a level of efficiency I'd never before received. As I drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing back there for me anymore. The feeling inside me wasn't one of vengeful triumph. I didn't feel a surge of victory. Instead, what settled over me was a profound and unshakable sense of peace. It was the quiet, clean exhaustion that comes after a long and brutal campaign has finally, definitively, ended. The war for my family's approval, a war I had been fighting and losing my entire adult life, was over. I hadn't won. I had simply withdrawn my troops from the field and declared a unilateral peace. My home, my small sanctuary, felt different when I walked through the door that night. The silence was no longer a shield or a place to recover. It was a kingdom, my kingdom. I was its sole ruler, and its only law was peace. I made a cup of chamomile tea, sat in my favorite armchair, and watched the moon rise over my garden. For the first time, there was no impending family dinner, no holiday, no birthday party looming on the horizon, threatening to disrupt my quiet reign. There was only tomorrow and the day after that, all of it belonging completely to me. I expected the frantic calls to begin the next morning. I was wrong. My final words, my final order, seemed to have stunned them into a state of paralysis. A day passed, then two. A week bled into the next. The silence from their end was absolute. It was the loudest thing they had ever said to me. It was the sound of them finally, truly, understanding that I was not the person they thought I was, and they had no idea how to speak to the person I actually was. During that time, I fell back into the simple, disciplined rhythm of my life. I woke with the sun, I worked in my garden, my hands in the soil, I read history books, I went for long walks, I reconnected with old friends from my real life, my true family. I was debriefing my own soul, letting the woman who had been General Vance and the woman who was now just Eleanor finally merge into one integrated being. The first contact came exactly 2 weeks after the gala. It was a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered with my usual, neutral. Vance? Eleanor, it's Clara. Her voice was tiny, hesitant. All the usual bright, chirpy confidence was gone. She sounded like a stranger. Hello, Clara, I said, my own voice even and calm. I got your number from Mom's phone. I hope that's okay. It's fine. An awkward silence stretched between us. How are you? She finally asked. I'm well, I replied. And you? I'm a mess, she admitted, her voice cracking. We're all a mess, Ellie. I am so sorry for everything, for the dinner, for my whole life. I guess. Apology accepted. I said it was that simple. I had no energy for grudges. Alex and we've been talking. He told me what it means. Your rank, the things you must have done. He looks at me differently now when I talk about you. Everyone does. Dad is. I've never seen him so quiet. He just sits in his study. Mom cries a lot. I didn't say anything. This was their fallout to manage, theirs to own. I just have to ask, Clara said, her voice a whisper. Why did you let us be so awful for so long? Why didn't you ever say anything? I thought for a moment, looking out at the sturdy oak tree in my backyard. Because you can't explain the view from the top of the mountain to someone who has never left the valley. Clara, I said. You had to see it for yourself. That conversation was the beginning of a new foundation, a fragile one, built on the rubble of the old. We didn't magically become best friends, but we started to become sisters. For the first time, she would call, and she would ask careful, respectful questions. Not about missions or secrets, but about me. What books did I like? What was my favorite part of the day? She was getting to know a stranger she had known her whole life. My mother was a different story. When she finally called, her voice was a bizarre cocktail of fear, shame, and a new, horrifyingly inappropriate kind of pride. Eleanor, dear, she began, her voice trembling. Your father and we just want to say, we are so proud. A general. My daughter, I ran into Susan Miller at the grocery store, and her husband is only a colonel. And I told her, well, my Eleanor. No, I said, my voice cutting through her chatter like a razor. It wasn't unkind, but it was absolute. You don't get to do that, Mom. You don't get to use my life's work as a point of social pride now. You gave up that right when you allowed Dad to call me a nobody. My service is not, and will never be. You're bragging right. That is a hard and fast rule. Do you understand? But there was a choked sob on the other end. Yes, Eleanor, she whispered. My relationship with my father has been the quietest. He has never apologized. I don't think he knows how. But about a month ago, a package arrived. Inside was a small, leather-bound, first edition copy of Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs. There was no note, but I knew what it was. It was a peace treaty. It was his white flag. It was the only apology he was capable of giving. I placed it on my bookshelf, in the history section. So, my life is quiet now. The family gatherings are few and far between. And when they happen, they are stilted, formal affairs. The easy condescension is gone, replaced by a fearful respect that is, in its own way, just as isolating. They look at me now and see a general. They still don't see me, not really, They may never. But they no longer see a failure. They no longer see a nobody. And the silence they leave me in is no longer a judgment. It's a boundary. And that is a form of peace I can live with. I'm telling you this, my friends, for one reason, your life is your story, and for too long, I let other people hold the pen. I let them write a narrative for me, a narrative of failure, of being less than, of not meeting expectations. I let them do it because I was so busy living a life of honor and duty. I forgot that the most important duty is the one you owe to yourself, the duty to be true. They called me a nobody in a room full of comfort and privilege. But I had been a somebody in rooms where the fate of the world was being decided. Their opinion, their judgment, was a ghost. It had no power until I gave it power. The moment I stopped needing their approval was the moment I truly took command of my own life. Your worth is not determined by a committee of your family members. It's not measured in dollars, or job titles, or relationship statuses. It is forged in your own private battles, in the integrity with which you live your life, in the quiet moments when you choose to be true to yourself, even when no one is watching. So if you are out there, and you feel like you've been given a role to play that doesn't fit, if you've been handed a script that makes you feel small, I want you to know that you have the power to set it on fire. You are the general of your own life. You set the mission. You define the terms of victory, and you alone, have the authority to decide who gets a place at your table. Thank you for being here and for listening to my story. If any part of this resonated with you, please hit that like and subscribe button. It means the world. Share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded of their own power, and drop a comment below. Tell me about a time you had to take command of your own story. Be brave, be true, and I'll see you in the next one.